if you will, when it comes to brambles. So this is the second of our webinar series this round on raspberry and blackberry production for the backyard. And we're really happy to see so many folks that are interested in this fruit. And certainly it feels like one of the last fruits that we really haven't covered in our extension office. One of the things that I was realizing when I was putting together this presentation for tonight is that there's a lot of information on this topic, and it is one that could easily be about 2 hours or so. And yet, we've got about 90 minutes tonight for that. So that being said, I may not get through everything because I want to ensure that we have time at the end to get some of those questions that you have answered. You were given the handout in today's email that went out, I believe it was around 10 a.m. this morning, and you can find a download from that link that was sent to you for tonight's handout. So tonight's plan, we're going to do a bit of a general overview. I'm coming to this as if you have some blackberries and raspberries, or maybe you're brand new. You've never grown either blackberry or raspberries, and you're just pretty interested in seeing if you can get them growing. So that's kind of what we'll start off with. It's just very much choosing your berries, thinking about establishment, thinking about site selection. A good portion of tonight will also be about pruning and trellising, as those go really hand in hand when it comes to growing this bramble group. We'll touch a little bit on pest management, such as insects, diseases, weed management, wildlife, but certainly those will just be somewhat introduced, and I will ensure that we have some additional resources to send to you that can go a little bit more in depth for some of those topics. We'll get a little bit into harvest, and then finally we'll conclude with some resources. So quite a lot of different things to cover tonight, but with the idea that all of these pieces should put you on the right track when it comes to planting them this season or getting your bramble patch back into some kind of order. So when we think about these brambles of raspberries and blackberries, they are in the genus Rubus, and that includes things such as raspberries and blackberries, as well as dewberries. Dewberries are one that we really don't see too much in the Midwest. We sometimes see it more common in other parts of the United States. I think one of the things to consider, when we think of all the fruits that you might be able to grow pretty well and successfully in the Midwest, such as peaches, apples, pears, strawberries, blueberries, and so forth, brambles are one that might be the easiest ones to work with. And yes, we'll talk about some of the main issues and challenges when it comes to them. And yet, because of their quickness to produce for you, you may find much greater success for this fruit compared to maybe some of the other fruits that certainly has challenges with it. As we think about even like a tree fruit where we need a lot of space, we have to prune pretty regularly on that. And sometimes we're waiting sometimes 4 or 5 years for some of our first fruit to develop from. Raspberries, blackberries, they can yield pretty well and pretty quickly for you. One of the things to consider about this plant is that they're going to produce canes, and these canes will be produced each year, and they will overwinter to produce fruit the following year. That typically has been what we have thought of when it comes to the raspberries and blackberries. Very traditionally, they produce a cane each year, that cane then overwinters, and then it's that next year where fruit is produced. However, there are now what's known as kind of Primocane types of brambles on the market that are going to produce a cane that season, and you're going to get fruit that season. And you do not have to deal with that overwintering that sometimes is a bit of something that you don't want to deal with. We'll talk more about that, the different types of, whether it's a Floricane type of berry or whether it's a Primocane type of berry. One of the other things that's I think really nice about this bramble group is that you have traditional red raspberries, you have black raspberries, you have purple raspberries, you have yellow raspberries, and of course you have blackberries with that too. So lots of different colors are available. Most of these grow pretty well for us in our Northern Illinois Midwestern climate. I always approach these presentations to really think about both the opportunities as well as the challenge. challenges. And when we think about the opportunities for brambles, most are just going to grow very well and productive for Northern Illinois. I think that's one of the great benefits with this group is that, yes, there can be some challenges. There can be, some issues of certainly winter damage that can sometimes happen. Certainly, these are plants that sometimes wildlife really likes much more than some of the others. And yet, on a seasonal basis, we see success in the backyard with these pretty much every year. We do see few disease problems. Certainly there are diseases, but not as necessarily severe as some of the other diseases that affect the other fruits that we might suggest growing in the backyard. I think great challenge and ability here is that you can grow different colors and flavors. And yet again, some of these you can actually harvest in that first year. There are what's known as kind of easy types that you kind of take out the issues of pruning and they kind of remove the trellising that you might need to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about easy. And yet again, that's kind of placed in quotes. So certainly when you're growing any fruit in Northern Illinois, there can certainly be challenges. These are ones that could also work for raised beds. I think there's potential here to contain them in raised beds if you get your soil figured out, something that we'll probably talk a lot more about next week in our additional webinar of raised beds and containers. One of the things that is very striking about this group is that there are many, many varieties. As I was pulling together resources for you all tonight, there's a number of handouts that go through sometimes 30, 35 different varieties of different types of raspberries and blackberries that in most years can really work well for our planting zone area. So then what are the challenges then? Blackberry is the one that we are going to cover tonight. We'll talk about some of the things that, certainly we see with this one, but it really depends on the year whether blackberry is going to grow well for you or not grow too well for you. So certainly the winter is kind of one of those issues when it comes to this one. Recognize too that you need pruning for productivity. That's just one thing that you need to consider with it, is that you may need some pruning. In most cases, pruning is going to be recommended for it. These can become a bramble very quickly. That is one thing that you have to recognize when it comes to your spacing, is that you want to ensure that they do not become this kind of mess that you're going to deal with and you're going to really encounter. When it comes to pest problems, insects and wildlife, this is happening during and before the season. Certainly we have an invasive insect that we'll talk about tonight, and that is a season-long issue that you're going to have to deal with, and something that has kept some folks deciding to grow certain raspberries and blackberries compared to other ones. Yet again, many are going to be thorn. There's also going to be trellising needs for most of these is also going to be really crucial here for them to really grow successfully. So let's get a little bit into this basic plant structure. When we think about this bramble and we think about raspberries and blackberries, they're producing canes every year. And you see this kind of a drawing that I did here for you all. So, every year you're having new primocanes that are developing from this plant of your raspberries or blackberries. And then it's these primocanes that were then overwinter to the next year and then now be called floricanes. And it's off of these floricanes that you're going to get the fruit. So depending, of course, on the type, most of the types, depending on the type you have, it may not actually produce fruit on the primocane. It needs to overwinter to then now be called a floricane and produce what you see here, these little small fruits, the raspberries. Some of the types that we talk about with raspberries and blackberries also have lots of suckers. And when it comes to kind of managing and keeping your plants in shape, it is ensuring that the suckers are not spreading too far. It also is that some types of raspberries will also move with rhizomes. So the rhizomes will kind of spread down a row. And that can also be something that you really need to kind of keep in mind, that sometimes when that rhizome hits the soil line, it then is going to produce an additional cane from that area. In essence, though, when we think about those traditional raspberries, brambles, they have the primocanes. It's first year. There's no fruit from them except if it's an everbearing type. We'll talk about what everbearing type is going forward. They'll develop fruit buds in the fall, and then they're going to overwinter into next year. So second year, you've got your floricanes. The buds are now opening up right now. They're producing fruit and then they die, and the floricanes are pruned out. You see in this drawing here that I've included some gray canes, and these gray canes are meant to denote that they are floricanes that already produced fruit and they needed to be removed because they're not going to produce any more fruit on this plant. So if you currently have raspberries and blackberries and you've kind of let stuff get away from you, right now you have floricanes in most cases, and you also have these old canes. Your primocanes are probably just starting to emerge, and they're going to be very green, lots of leaf material is going to be on them. So that all being said, when you're thinking of what type of raspberry or blackberry you're going to purchase, you will find that it will list it's either a floricane or a primocane type. And that will further dictate harvest and management. What that means is that there are now varieties on the market that are primocane producing. So you are, say, you're planting them in 2021, they're producing primocanes, and then you're getting a harvest off of them in the fall. Versus other types that we would call floricane that would be producing primocanes this year. They're not going to produce any berries off of the primocanes, and then we're going to have to overwinter them into 2022, and then they're finally going to produce the berries for us. Clear as mud, I'm sure. We'll get hopefully more into clarification as we go along today. When you're looking through catalogs, other resources, you're going to see a lot of words that basically mean the same. If it is denoted that this raspberry variety or blackberry variety is primocane, it also may be called fall bearing. It also may be called everbearing. If it is described as a floricane producing type of raspberry or blackberry, it would be also called a summer or June berry. Those are some of the older words that were used for these. So if you have an established patch, you may find that you mostly have floricane type of raspberry or blackberry. So when thinking about adding new ones to the backyard and choosing different types, if it's fall harvest, if you're thinking I want to just do my berries in the fall, if you're thinking ease of pruning, traditionally, this is going to be a primocane type that you're going to be after because this is going to be a little bit easier to prune, which we'll talk about tonight. If you're more traditional, say, or you're wanting more of that summertime raspberry with it, and one that really does require quite a bit of pruning, then we would suggest choose floricane. Would be one that would be very kind of traditional with it. We'll go into more detail on both of this going forward. One of the things to mention, though, is that many of the primocane types, so it is that it might be primocane type, will produce primocanes, say this year, they will produce berries in the fall of 2021. And then I have the option to overwinter them into next year, in which they could then produce additional berries in, say, June. So I have the ability to do kind of a second crop as really possible on the primocane type. So let's go into a little bit more about these raspberry types as well as the blackberry types. You'll note that what I've tried to do for most of these slides is to also get into the actual spacing between plants, as well as how many feet should you consider between rows. So you see here with red raspberry, red floricane type, so very traditional red raspberry that is going to need 2 years to produce fruit. It's going to produce primocanes in summer 2021, which overwinter into next year of 2022. And then that's when you're actually going to get your red raspberries, so known as summer bearing. A couple of varieties are listed here. This is Boyne. which is very hardy, very good for freezing. Killarney, good for fresh market. Lauren has good quality, large fruit. Titan is one we see a lot of folks really like, has a large kind of mild fruit flavor to it. When you look at each of these varieties, you'll see a lot of very generic terms, of course, about how the fruit tastes or the size, but you still want to step back and think, okay, is it going to have thorns on it? Is it maybe even going to be hard for me to kind of trellis? So perhaps I need to kind of consider trellising it with that too. So red Primocane, these are 2 to 3 feet between plants, and then say 6 to 10 feet between rows. So yet again, these would be my fall bearing, ever bearing type. So I would plant them in right now, say spring of 2021. They would produce Primocanes for me. I could potentially get fruit off of them in the fall of 2021. And then at that point, I have a decision to make. I could prune them all the way out, prune them all the way back to the soil line, or I might leave the Primocanes in place and then get that second crop. So allow for the Primocanes to become Floricanes in 2022. These tend to have less disease pressure. And the reason that we'll talk about tonight for that is based on how you're pruning, how you're cutting them back. You see a number of ones listed here that we commonly see at home and garden centers. This is Joan J. Jacqueline is the one pictured here. It is a little bit more of an earlier one, even though it is a fall bearing type and a Primocane type. Heritage has very good yields, very hard to pick. So that's one that just to mention. Nova is one that we see a lot of interest in, and we'll talk a little bit more about why Nova might be considered a good one for you, but it has very good winter hardiness. And it's also one that the Japanese beetles, for some reason, don't really gravitate towards. I'm not necessarily sure why that is, but Minnesota and other places have really mentioned that it has some really good ability to not be in, Japanese beetles aren't interested in it. You will also see going through some of our catalogs from home and garden centers that they'll say things like autumn bliss or even autumn Britain. And certainly that's going to denote that this is going to be a fall bearing raspberry. For my non-reds, so my yellow, yet again, this is basically a red raspberry, just doesn't have any of that red pigment in it. You will find Primocanes types, you will find Floricane types. So just like the previous one, raspberries, red raspberries, there are Primocane producing and there are Floricane producing types. Fall gold has been suggested for very good marketability, and is one that has very good heat tolerance to it, which you might consider needing. Honey Queen is a Primocane producing one, which has peach colored berries, but some very nice color with these yellow berries. I don't necessarily think you're going to find too much difference in flavor, but I think certainly based on appearance wise, these can just be very beautiful, very good looking berries compared to other. And yet again, looking at this list, you would go through with kind of each of these varieties and determine if it would be Primocane producing berries or if it's going to be a Floricane producing berry. So for the black raspberry, this is a group that you need to recognize that it just is not always going to be as winter hardy as your reds. They just have an issue where they're just not going to be as winter hardy, and they may need some sort of protection on them compared to others. They also tend to be a little bit more compact. I think that is one of the benefits with this group, is that they kind of have a hilling kind of setup that really allows you to not have to say, have a full trellis row. So you don't have to run that trellis 20 or 25 feet. They are very disease susceptible, and they sometimes are less productive because of that. You will find many of the production guides will suggest from a homeowner standpoint that you still want to have these black raspberries planted sometimes 50 to 75 feet away from your red raspberries because of their susceptibility to diseases. See a number of varieties that are listed here. Bristol we see quite often. Jewel is also one that we see. And yet again, if I was concerned about, say, the winter hardiness of my raspberries, I might consider Jewel, just because it has some very hardiness to it. For my purple type, 3 to 5 feet between, 10 to 12 feet between the rows of my purple raspberries. This is one that's a cross between the red and the black raspberry, so a much different color to it. And it sometimes is noted for having such a good flavor that it's very good for juices and wine. It's been used quite a bit for wine as the suggestion for this one. It does tend to be a bit more compact, has that moderate hardiness that we kind of expect. And a couple of varieties are listed here, such as Brandywine, which is a bit more large and kind of tart fruit to it. Royalty has a bit more of a large and sweet fruit. And Estate then is a cross between them, the flavor between Brandywine and Royalty. If I was thinking that I wanted to choose maybe one of these non-red raspberries, the purple raspberry might be the one that I choose, just based on having potentially a little bit more hardiness than some of the, say, the yellow or the certainly the black raspberry. But I think also the compactness of it would also be something very beneficial compared to kind of some of the others. There are container types of raspberries, and you see these a lot more often at some of the home and garden centers. And this is what you see here in this photo. I was at one of my home and garden centers a couple days ago and was just kind of looking around to see if they had any of these container types. These are thornless. They tend to be about a third the size of a regular raspberry plant. And if you were thinking of the space saving, that this could potentially be one of them. They do need a minimum soil depth of about 15 inches. So you would need to take this container raspberry and then combine it with another container. The plant height tends to be about 2 to 3 feet, so it's pretty short. No staking, trellising is really needed, and then you would prune similar to a standard. You see in this photo that you do have some, looks to me that you do already have some flowers on your berries. And so I'd say you probably have a mixture of some Floricanes already in there, along with maybe potentially some Primocanes that are developing off of that too. Some examples, these are raspberry shortcake, blackberry baby cake. If anyone has had experience with these, I'd love to hear about it. Just add to the chat box. I've not grown them myself, so others have some more experience than I do. I think one of the challenges you have to consider with this one is going to be overwintering. Depending on the container that you have chosen, you're going to have to ensure that this is overwintering successfully. So because of these container types, we're really not talking about, say, planting them into a raised bed. These would be really successful staying in the container that you choose for them to stay in. So you have to think about drainage, you have to think about fertility, kind of some of those other pieces with it. For our blackberries, this is both Primocane and Floricane types. But yet again, you have to recognize they're not winter hardy as raspberries, especially these newer varieties on the market are just not as winter hardy as some of my others, as some of the other raspberry varieties that are available. Some of the varieties that we would recommend include Prime Arc Freedom. This is thornless and it's Primocane. So based on that prime name there, we know that it is a Primocane producing one. Apache is Floricane producing, so it's going to produce Primocanes that then have to overwinter in order to then produce your blackberries that next season. Illinois Hardy has been recommended, but it is extremely hard to find. It's a very difficult plant to find. And so while we have recommended it, it's very hard to find at most home and garden centers and even through a lot of different companies. One that is a little bit closer to Illinois Hardy as far as its flavor is Chester. Prim Gem is zone 4. It's Primocane and it's thornless. Honestly, that kind of checks off every 3 boxes. All the boxes I need in deciding blackberries is Prim Gem. It's certainly hardy to win to zone 4, which is great. It's going to produce canes during the summer that they're going to produce my blackberries, and it's thornless. So I don't have to worry about any winter damage or worry about any issue with the canes being damaged between seasons. So that's how I would kind of approach blackberries, is go for a Primocane, just based on the fact that it may be very difficult to overwinter the canes into next year for them to be Floricane producing. So choosing your berries, one of the things to recognize with a lot of the varieties now is that they have a 8 to 15 year lifespan. You know, last year when we talked about perennial vegetables, where sometimes they're going from 15 to 20 years, if not more, this is one group where, ooh, sorry about that. I've got a I apologize, a storm has just moved in and I had a window open. All right, I'm back with you. So these have 18 to 15 years. You compare that to other perennial, say the perennial vegetables where 25, 30-year patches is common. These have a shorter shelf life or shorter lifespan, really. We also see decline after year 12. And so that's something to kind of consider with your patch, is that you may be approaching that year 12 where decline is beginning to happen. If you have concerns of winter damage or winter hardiness, or even you're in an area like Joe Davis County where we see a lot of deer activity and you're concerned about damage from them, and you also don't want to prune, Primocane type is probably going to be your best bet. You're producing canes in that single season. They are producing fruit for you. You're coming through and you're pruning them all down to the soil line, usually in end of October into November, and then the process starts over again the next spring. Other decisions to consider too: bare root or plant. You see the plant itself here. A bit of a higher success rate typically if it is a plant compared to, say, a bare root. This is just based on sometimes soil temperatures that are taking their time to warm up. Another thing you'll note is erect, semi-erect, or trailing. Erect is going to be a raspberry, blackberry that is pretty sturdy. It's going to produce canes that stay kind of erect and straight up. And sometimes you find that you don't need to actually trellis them or provide any support. A semi-erect, as the name denotes, there's a little bit of sturdiness to their canes. However, they may actually lay down and they really sometimes need some trellising. If it is a trailing type of raspberry or blackberry, it needs trellising. It's kind of going to be a little bit all over the place, if you will. Very bramble mess-like in a way. You also see thorny or thornless. You know, consider that's going to be something really crucial for what you're thinking about when it comes to harvesting. You may also see spine or spineless. That would mean the same thing as far as thorns on the plant or not on the plant. We always suggest purchasing from a reputable nursery, home, and garden center. I will share that as I look through some of the companies we have suggested previously, a lot of them are sold out for the year. So you may have much better success going to your local home and garden center in the next couple of weeks to plant these. This group is also one for establishment. We need full sun. So it is not going to do well in the shade. I know that there are certainly wild types of brambles that are in woodlands and shaded areas and they do well. But for these new types of cultivars and these new varieties, they really need that full sun, and they also need well-drained soil. So yet again, you're not going to do poor soil to grow these brambles in. They need some good airflow, but not too windy. So consider that as well, that they don't need to be sitting out there getting hit by the wind, as that can sometimes damage these canes with it. You're looking for a pH about 6 to 6.5, very much fertile soils. You know, adding manure, adding compost, those are all ingredients that these plants would really thrive in. If you're thinking about a row, consider kind of 2 to 3 wide row is what you're after. That can really allow for the plant to produce the canes it needs to produce without, say, getting too crazy for you. And then, of course, space on their growth habit, space on what types of plants you're growing. We do find that early spring planting is just a little bit better than fall, and that typically is going to be kind of because of the development of the Primocanes, and that they need kind of those warming soil conditions compared to the colder soil conditions. Some additional thoughts here, the different types, the red, the yellow raspberries, these can spread to about 12 inches. These are also a group that would do really well in a hedgerow or kind of down a single kind of line. You compare that to purple or black, which tend to kind of cluster in a bit of a hill, and then they produce canes, canes from that hill. These groups, no matter the raspberry or the blackberry, they are very sensitive to drying out. And you want to consider that when it comes to your soil, that it does not stay saturated, it does not drain too quickly, that it's a good solid soil that allows for a slow drainage of them. These, of course, would also work in a raised bed. I think there's some great potential to grow them in raised beds. I think the only drawback you might encounter is the actual soil depth. So, sometimes you might have a raised bed that maybe is 6 to 8 inches in height, and you may need to actually bring that bed up to maybe 10 to 12 inches, I think, just based on these root systems and these canes with them. For field fertility, this is very similar to some of our other vegetables that we talk about, a balanced fertilizer of 10-10-10. This one would be perfect for it. You would do it after planting, and then sometimes a yearly application of this balanced fertilizer would be beneficial. And then add compost, add manure every year, and that would really help with your plants. So on to pruning then. So yet again, going back to this image that you see here, we have Floricanes and we have Primocanes. Floricanes are going to be 2-year-old canes, and they, depending on the type, they might be producing that fruit for you. Primocanes, new canes that season. They are just getting started this year, so they've yet to really develop, just yet. And so what that means probably right now, depending on the type that you have Floricanes perhaps, or you have Primocanes that are just starting to grow for you. The main pruning that we talk about when it comes to raspberries and blackberries is removal of canes that previously produced fruit. So it is that a lot of times every season when we're going out to do any sort of pruning, we're looking for a lot of the gray canes, those canes that are kind of more woodier, they're kind of grayish in this color. If I looked at those canes, I would actually see that they had kind of buds from the previous fruit that had already produced. So they're no longer going to produce any fruit for me. That's going to be the main kind of pruning that you're going to be doing. This should be done in dormancy, but yet again, it's going to be based on the type, which we'll go through each of the different types as we're going along. One of the ones that I was unable to cover too much tonight is black raspberry. And black raspberry is one where there is some additional pruning that you need to do based on its type. I did upload a new handout into the link to the handouts tonight. I just uploaded it about an hour ago, and I'll make sure that you see that, because if you're growing black raspberries and purple raspberries, there can be some additional pruning that you need to do compared to some of your traditional ones. So let's get into it then. All right, so I'm kind of back here yet again with the drawing that you see here on the left, and I've tried to kind of do it in steps. That's been what I've tried to do. So if you have a Primocane type of raspberry, Primocane yet again being what we might call a fall-bearing raspberry, or potentially what we might call an ever-bearing raspberry. There's two strategies. So the first thing, of course, is you're pruning all canes that produced fruit. You then are thinning out Floricanes to about 5 inches between. So I'm kind of coming through here and I'm thinning out my Floricanes to about 5 inches between. And then this summer, Primocanes will produce fruit in the fall, overwinter then, and produce again in the summer. So realistically, these Primocane raspberries, I have the potential to get 2 crops. I have the potential to get my raspberries off of Floricanes that have overwintered from the previous year. And then any primocanes that are developing, any new green primocanes that are developing this season, say 2021, I'm able to harvest them in the fall. And then after that fall harvest, I could then let them overwinter into 2022 and harvest from. So get kind of two crops basically is what I'm able to do off of everbearing and off of the everbearing, the primocane types, which we see here. Or we mow it all down. You see in this image, I only have green. I only have primocanes that are producing, and the primocanes are producing my raspberries. They're going to produce them in the fall, and then at the end of the fall, at the end of the season, I mow them all the way down to the soil line. And then next year, new primocanes emerge, and the cycle starts again. Raspberries are produced off the primocanes in the fall of 2022, and I mow them all down again. So that is where you have the potential to get two crops because you could let a primocane overwinter, or you go down to one harvest and you take out any issues when it comes to trellising. You're having to, with this method, you're not having to worry sometimes about disease. You're not worrying too much about wildlife yet again, because the wildlife doesn't really have too much to eat off of. And maybe you're not worried too much about winter damage either in this scenario. So yet again, it's based on, is this a primocane type of raspberry? And you may find that if you have purchased a raspberry and planted in the last couple of years, if it's not producing fruit on those green primocanes, then it's not going to be what we consider a primocane type of raspberry. So the Floricane raspberries are the traditional ones. These are the ones that we pretty much see a lot of, that folks are mostly growing. And you can certainly grow these too and find varieties that have this. In this scenario, these yet again would be called summer bearing or June bearing. So it is that in dormancy in the winter, I'm pruning out any of the canes that already produced fruit the last year. So I would look on these kind of grayish canes. I would see little buds where the raspberries were previously. These would be pruned out during dormancy. I would also do a kind of heading cut, if you will. So I would kind of look at about 5 feet and I would come in and I would cut back my floricanes to about 5 feet. And this should trigger more of these kind of lateral growth here on the side to allow sometimes for some better shape of fruit. At the same time, I also have primocanes that are developing. So they're not going to produce any raspberries for me this year because they have to overwinter into next year. Once I have harvested from my floricanes this summer, I could go ahead and prune them out. I could go ahead and remove them. And then next year, the primocanes that developed in 2021 overwinter into next 2022, where they then would be called floricanes and they then would produce raspberries. So the drawback with this, of course, is that we have to ensure that they're off the ground, they're trellised correctly, because the fruit is going to be developing off the floricanes. So for floricane blackberries, step one, yet again, prune out canes that produced fruit already. So those will be the ones that need to come out kind of during this dormancy period. You would also want to actually cut these canes back 3 to 4 feet. So those floricane blackberries would be cut back about 3 to 4 feet. And then you would also do an additional step during this dormancy period where you would actually prune kind of these side branches, which you see here at number 3. And you want about 5 to 6 buds on each of these kind of side branches where the fruit is. And this will just allow for a much better balance of fruit on the floricane blackberry. So if it's primocane blackberry though, then this would be the same thing that you would do for primocane raspberry, where you would be cutting it all the way to the soil line. But for floricane blackberries, I would then come through here and I would do a heading cut. I would prune out what previously produced, and then I would come through with the side shoots. All this being done during dormancy. So let's say you have an established bramble patch, an established growing area of raspberries and blackberries, and you just don't know what to do. Um, Certainly start with removal of dead canes. That would be the one thing that you would notice is kind of blackish, very grayish looking colored brambles that have lived more than 2 years. And at this point are just not really serving you much purpose. So it's great to go ahead and get these out because they're just impeding and keeping you from really getting to the harvest that you need for here with this. You would also probably want to consider go ahead and removing some of those floricanes. So it may be that previously these canes have produced or are going to produce this year, and that would be the strategy, is removing some of those as well. You also want to consider management of the suckers, the rhizome spread. That's really where we see a lot of these canes develop from, is right here where this rhizome, depending on how it spreads, once it hits that soil line, that sometimes is now where we see a lot of cane develop from. So it is kind of coming back to where that kind of cane crown is from there. The number of primocanes per plant can really vary. I think you sometimes see 6 to 8 primocanes would be what you're after in most situations. And then you would also even want to think about pruning the width of the row. Ideally, this might be about 2 to 3 feet is really what you're after. At the same time, if you felt like it was just too far gone, there was just too much to go in there and identify your floricanes and your primocanes, it might just be best to just kind of cut it all to the ground or try to trim out as much as you can and see how the plant responds, especially if it's just really far gone from there, would be which one you would want to look at. If you had inherited a raspberry row or raspberry area and you weren't sure whether this was, say, a fall bearing type of raspberry or a summer bearing type of raspberry, certainly you would look at the primocanes. If the primocanes are producing fruit in that single season, so they have grown in the spring of 2021 and they are producing raspberries in the fall of 2021, there's a very strong chance that you're dealing with a primocane fall bearing type of raspberry. Compare that to a June bearing, summer bearing raspberry, where the primocanes are mostly just going to be developing their leaf material and the buds have yet to really open with that. So that would be a way to kind of look at both of them and see what you have. We would recommend mulching for raspberries and blackberries. Organic mulches, such as the wood chips that you see here, would be very ideal for this group. It would allow for good moisture and allow for the rhizome to kind of develop really well. When it comes to, say, adding additional compost, manure, and so forth, you would just want to pull back that mulch and then place it around your area and then cover it back with that wood mulch. But this would help quite a bit when it comes to allowing for weed control to be addressed. I think that's one of the main challenges with this group is the weed issue. Sometimes you see landscape fabric, so this is something that could be okay. Certainly expect several years of use, sometimes much more so. The challenge here is that it can restrict primocane emergence from the roots. That would be the only thing to consider, is that you may have found that the opening for this landscape fabric is just not as big as it needs to be. We do see folks that use plastic, kind of a plastic mulch, and usually this needs some sort of irrigation. So it is very hard for the plants, to get everything that they need from an irrigation standpoint. It's also one that usually breaks down in one season. So, and like with landscape fabric, it has the potential to reduce primocane emergence from the roots. So on to trellising. This is something that we do recommend. You're going to find with most of the varieties that you're thinking of growing, that certainly some are erect. There are certainly some that you may find you don't need to actually get away with any sort of trellising. And yet in most cases, what we see is that for a raspberry, blackberry patch to really thrive and allow for the plants to get the light that they need and get the the water and soil nutrients that they need, that the trellising could allow for the plant to spread out to where it needs to be. It's also something that helps quite a bit with pest management. When you have areas that allow for more shade or more areas that would allow for things to not dry out successfully, you run the risk that pest pressure can increase as well as disease severity can increase too. So always consider your spacing needs. The varieties you're growing, you may find you don't need that much of a trellising system like you see here in this photo. One other thing to recognize is you may require additional labor. So occasionally with these trellising systems, you do need to tie up the green primocanes to the trellis. Depends on which one you're after, but certainly that's something that we do see a lot of. One other thing to mention is Floricane types. So summer bearing, June bearing, those that are going to have canes that overwinter from season to season, from one season to the next. These are very tall plants. And so a trellising would be recommended because of how big these plants are. For a primocane type, if you choose a certain one that maybe is erect, you may find you don't even need a trellis, or you need a very small trellis that you don't have to worry too much about having a very big fancy trellis itself. So to show you a couple of these, what these look like, here is like a V trellis design. And so you see within this drawing that I did that we kind of have those kind of metal T-posts at the bottom. So you can kind of see here that, hold on a second, I'm just going to erase this. So you see here with these, we have kind of two T-posts at the end. They're at a slant and they're creating kind of this V system. And then I'm running a wire gauge down the line where it's going to connect to these other two. It's not shown in this photo. They also are then fastened at the bottom at the soil line and kind of anchored, kind of given a slant, so to allow for much better weight distribution of the plants. You also see with this one that there's about a line at about 2 feet, 3 feet, and about 4 feet. And certainly if you have a variety that's very vigorous and very tall, you may find that you need a very tall T-post to go even higher up than that. But this can work pretty well for very small plantings where you just have a number of plants. They are producing both the primocanes and the floricanes, which you see here. And this can provide some really good support and allow for very good airflow and management. The T-trellis is another one you saw previously on a couple slides ago, very traditional one that is seen quite often. This is one that there's a line of about 2 feet, and there's 2 feet, and there's one in about 5 feet. And both of these are actually, the bottom one's a little bit narrow. So the first line where my laser pointer is, this is about 18 to 24 inches. And then the top one is going to be about 22 to 24 inches. And the reason for this is that we fully expect a lot of our raspberries to just be a little bit more vigorous higher up in the plant. So right now in the first year of growth with my primocanes, I don't need to, I can be kind of tighter. But as these plants get bigger and they overwinter as floricanes, I now need to actually have a much greater width to them, which will allow for the plants to really kind of spread out. And in essence, it just creates a nice separation for primocanes and floricanes. That's really what it's doing more than anything, is creating this separation. It also is one that works well for a lot of light as well as airflow for the canes too. There's also the eye trellis, and you see with this eye trellis that it's pretty simplistic. It is that we have a 3-foot line, and then I also have a 5-foot line. And at both of those junctions, certainly I need to tie the canes there. The canes are not just going to naturally lean up against this trellis. I actually need to tie the canes in that situation. But ideally, you also note that I have green here. So realistically, this is probably going to be really good for primocanes developing more than it is going to be for a floricane. That would probably be a little bit taller than that. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty easy setup. I've got my 3-foot line, I've got my 5-foot line. I've got a post on one end, a post on the other end. And certainly I could go much further than just the two that you see here. And in fact, I would suggest going much further than that. This is one that also might be a little bit better for blackberries. And the reason I say better for blackberries is because when we get into thinking about winter protection, a trellising like this might be easy for you to put a cloth to cover the blackberries or allow you to modify it. Yields can be lower than other trellises, just kind of keep that in mind. The reason being that it's only having one side of protection, one side of support compared to two sides that could kind of allow for the plants to kind of go in both directions, if you will. If you're looking at black and purple raspberries, know that because they have more of a hilling situation, you can actually get away with a very, very modified trellising system. So because they're going to produce the primocanes from this hill and stay there realistically, you could actually kind of individually trellis with a T-post. So that's what you actually see here in this drawing, where we have black and black raspberries. And I've got my two T-posts for each one. They're slanted to create this X. Of course, what's not seen is also some additional trellising line to go around it, but it works really well. It can allow for the plants to really thrive. And it all, yet again, is because the black and purple raspberry tends to have more of a hilling system to it. You would also space this about 4 feet between. That's really getting back to what we traditionally see with spacing of those. I think the other benefit here is that you also would be able to provide some winter protection, and that may be something very advantageous for both of these that maybe in some years aren't as winter hardy. So blackberry trellising is going to look very similar to the raspberries. When determining what type of system you set up will ultimately be based on whether it's a Primocane or a Floricane type of blackberry. And still yet, we want to mention, especially in Northern Illinois, winter protection is recommended. They're just a little bit, they're not as winter hardy, especially if it is a Floricane producing type of blackberry, where you have to overwinter those Primocanes into the next year in order to produce blackberries for you. And so you see here in this photo from Oregon State University, where they've come through and they've provided winter protection for their blackberries. And this row cover is pretty heavy duty. It stays in place most winter time to really protect these Primocanes that are now called Floricanes and need protection. There's a lot of different DIY systems out there where they will actually take these and kind of lay them flat on the soil line and then cover them up with sheets of cloth. You may be able to do that too. I know a number of growers in the Rockford area have what's called a flex trellis that allows them to basically raise the trellis standing straight up or vertically, but then also allows them to lay it horizontal in the wintertime. And you might be able to kind of modify and kind of do something with that. But certainly I would say that if you're growing Floricane type of blackberries in Northern Illinois, you need to consider winter protection. If it's Primocane, if it says Prime Art Freedom or Prime Gem, you're not having to overwinter those the canes. And so you probably don't need to worry too much about winter protection. So on to our last kind of section for the night, kind of the best practices when it comes to pest management. Certainly this group of blackberries and raspberries is not without challenges when it comes to pest management. And, you know, I'm not saying at all that this is a plant that is free from any sorts of diseases or insects or and so forth. It certainly has them, and you need to recognize that. So some general things that we might recommend before we get into some of these pests. Certainly space correctly for airflow. That's very crucial when it comes to not only disease, but also insect populations that can sometimes build up if things are allowed to stay wet. You also want to consider pruning and trellising to address problems. You know, if you have a plant and you've chosen that it's going to be, say, fall bearing or it's going to be summer bearing, recognize that pruning and trellising and pruning out what needs to go when it does can help quite a bit for disease pressure and insects. Consider removing and destroying bad berries throughout the season. So as you're working through your raspberries, consider having a bucket that is a dump bucket. It is bad berries, it's ones that you don't want to eat, and throw them away. And I'll talk about why we throw them away in a couple more slides. We don't compost raspberries or blackberries for a certain reason. Try to keep the area as weed-free as possible. Consider winter protection for some of those plants, for raspberries and blackberries that will produce fruit on floricanes. Ensuring that they have some winter protection can be really nice. Maintain row width, and then prune after harvest or shortly after. The longer some of those canes stay on that are no longer going to produce from you, the more challenging it can be for them to provide disease, to lead to insect problems, to just provide a lot of kind of things that you're not really after. In this drawing you see here, I tried to kind of go through some of these practices. You know, you can see here where my gray canes are. They're no longer producing, I'm removing them. I have a good trellising support system and space in place. I'm removing some of those suckers that maybe gravitate and kind of develop because they're just not serving any purpose here. I'm adding additional wood chips and mulch to keep weeds at a problem. The red here is supposed to be bad berries, which you would collect. Frankly, I just realized it looks like a pizza, so I'm not suggesting putting pizza underneath the raspberries. These little red dots are bad berries that you actually want to remove. Two of the most common bramble diseases are cane blight and spur blight. In this top photo, we actually see the cane blight. So it is kind of a grayish discoloration that's formed on the floricanes in most years. So it does look very different than kind of those other canes that you typically would see, especially younger canes. The infection on the leaf is further here. This is the spur blight. So this would be something that you would see more often on the actual Primocanes. You may not see it until this season as it starts to form. The strategies here for addressing this one is to ensure you have some good airflow. It's also to remove any floricanes after they have harvested, after they have produced the berries, if it is a floricane type. You want to also prune out any diseased primocanes. And then if it is a primocane producing type where it's just fall bearing, you would want to mow the patch in late winter. So don't even allow for it to overwinter. Go ahead and mow the patch back. Fungicides could be used, but really we see these rarely recommended. I think one of the challenges with this is that it can sometimes look like winter damage, and you want to pay kind of close attention to that. Certainly, you know, if you encounter this and you're concerned that you may have one or the other, you're more than welcome to send me photos or even drop off samples at our University of Illinois Extension office to make sure that you have what you have and it's not necessarily winter damage. For weed management, one of the things we always suggest before any new planting, whether it's raspberries, blackberries, anything, is to prep the area before planting to make sure that it is as weed-free as possible. And certainly we recognize it's very hard to do this, especially if you have a certain weed species that's really kind of taken over parts of the garden. So site selection is really crucial. You know, the raspberries, especially early on, are not going to perform as well with some of the other plants that you might have in place, or rather some of the other weeds that are already in there. Consider inter-row management. Look towards having a good wood mulch layer down to really keep weeds at bay or keep them from being much of an issue. Of course, we recommend sometimes mechanical, which is hand pulling. You may have the ability to use other types of equipment too, depending on what your spacing is. There are chemical ones. Some of these are available to use for when it is a primocane versus a floricane type of raspberry. Look at your label, just see if that is possible before looking at some of those chemical options. So for the insects then, you've got cane borer, you have crown borer, very common to see both of those. It will appear as if the cane is very wilted. And if you looked at the entire cane, you would see closer to the line, soil line, just where the cane borer has moved in. You see here kind of a picnic beetle or the sap beetles, very common on some of our fruits, the raspberries as they're developing. Some of the best suggestion we have is prune, destroy infected canes through the crown, remove any wilted canes. Sanitation is going to be very crucial for picnic beetles because they really like that sanitation, or they really like those bad berries. So it is that as you're going down the line and you're harvesting berries, remove the bad berries and destroy them, because kind of anything like that can attract picnic beetles. Picnic beetles also tend to like areas that are a little bit more unkempt, if you will. So if it is a raspberry patch that's very overgrown and just kind of allowed to be overgrown, you're liable to have much more picnic beetles and kind of the sap beetles too. Traps are available. Traps may sometimes work depending on which insect you're dealing with or you're after. This is one of the borers, which you see here. So you can actually see, you may not actually see the insect, but you certainly would see potentially kind of this girdling of the cane here, which once that's removed, you would cut it down the line, and you would actually see this delineation in the actual cane. This cane would most likely be kind of blackish, brownish, just looking very unhealthy compared to some of the other canes that you might be encountering. And the best recommendation we would probably have for this would be to actually remove that cane, and hopefully that might address the problem. Japanese beetles can also like your raspberries. You certainly see this photo from University of Minnesota that depending on when they are developing, you may find you have a raspberry Japanese beetle problem. Nova is a raspberry that has been recommended that doesn't tend to have much appeal for Japanese beetles. So that might be one to consider planting if you are thinking of that you deal with these and you're trying to manage them in some ways. We still recommend kind of hand picking, shaking the Japanese beetles early morning into a bucket of soapy water. That will tend to drown them, and then you can destroy them from there. We don't recommend traps. Those yellow hanging traps tend to attract way more Japanese beetles than you would ever have in your backyard setting. There are some chemical control methods, but know that some of them do have some high toxicity to pollinators. So yet again, it would depend on when your raspberries are flowering, as certainly pollinators are needed for raspberries to develop, where you might be able to utilize some chemical control, but just kind of be mindful of that there can be some toxicity to your pollinators. There is neem oil, there's spinosyn, which is organic, that are recommended for Japanese beetles, and still want to have good practices for those. Even though they're organic, they may have some impact on your pollinators. But the one insect that you need to be concerned with if you are looking to grow raspberries and blackberries is spotted-winged Drosophila. And these are zoomed in photos of this very small fruit fly that is attacking most of the soft fruits that we have growing in Northern Illinois, as well as most parts of the Midwest. So as your berries are developing, this fly, the female, is coming in, it's laying eggs into the berries as they're ripening, and then maggots are hatching from your red raspberries. It's very unappealing. It is an insect that we have been dealing with for numerous years now at this point. And it's one that you have to recognize that you have, however short or long your season is, the spotted-winged Drosophila is going to be there. For some folks, what this has meant is that they are actually just doing Floricane developing raspberries, so June summer bearing raspberries, instead of fall raspberries, because sometimes the fall Primocane development is allowing for just the insect to be there for a much longer period of time on berries as they're ripening compared to a Floricane summer bearing type. So you can see here the images, what this looks like. So you've got, sometimes you will see the actual fly on the berries, but sometimes you really don't. And really the fly itself is laying eggs into the berries as it's ripening. And then of course the maggots are hatching out from it. And you may not realize that until you harvest and until you start washing them, that these maggots are happening and are coming from the berries that you've spent so much time wanting to harvest from. And recognize this is a fun topic at dinner time tonight too. So you have to recognize you're going to have these. There's just no way to grow these in this area and say that you don't have these. You have them. Sometimes the severity isn't as severe, but certainly this is something you need to recognize, that if you grow raspberries now, we're going to grow raspberries and blackberries in the future, you have to deal with spotted wing Drosophila. There are monitoring traps, and this is what you see here, this kind of mixture. And it's important to recognize that this monitoring trap is just as its name denotes. It's just monitoring, and it's telling you that you have spotted wing Drosophila and you need to do something about it. There are fine nettings that are available to keep these out, and yet they can be pretty expensive, and we really don't see them from a homeowner backyard perspective where it makes a lot of sense. I think at this point, the suggestion we have is to tolerate but remediate. So it is that you want to consider freezing the berries if you feel like you have that spotted wing Drosophila is there. You also want to consider picking the bad berries and destroying a plastic bag in the sun. So you could deposit the bad berries and just throw them away, but you don't want to compost and you don't want to bury them, because the eggs and the adults will actually survive from these berries. The actual larvae, the maggots will. So that is one challenge here. The other thing to consider is that, proper pruning, good trellising, good airflow can begin to reduce some of the severity in the field in your raspberries. One other suggestion that some folks have had is to hang up hummingbird feeders. Hummingbirds, just their presence has shown that it may impact spotted wing Drosophila populations. So just hanging up the hummingbird feeders and the presence of hummingbirds may actually reduce the severity of spotted wing Drosophila. That research is still very new, but that might be a really good practice to consider. So to show you a bit more of the males and what they look like. So if I had my actual trap, I would be able to see kind of the bands of the males, which you kind of note here as what you're after. So yet again, it's just a monitoring trap. It's not actually trapping these insects. And there's the male there, and kind of see, once you start to know what they look like, it becomes pretty easy to look at them and find them. And this would be something to, I would say look at a monitoring trap probably mid-June is when I would start to hang these. And then depending on your growing area, you probably might expect to see them around that time, and it may be for a couple months. So raspberries can be eaten by wildlife. It's not one that they don't like, so recognize that too, especially I know some of the folks in Joe Davis County where we have a very wide deer population. As far as the damage from them, you might be okay if it's a Primocane type. So yet again, the Primocane being something that it's going to produce new canes in the spring. They're going to produce my fall berries, and then I'm mowing them down, and it might be okay, because if it's any damage in the winter time or in the fall, I was going to mow those canes down anyway. So you may be okay there. But if it's Floricane, the rabbits love them. The rabbits just really love raspberries, especially these canes that are overwintering into that next year. So going from Primocane to Floricane, the rabbits love them. Look to remove tall grass areas, exclusion. You can find hot pepper spray, can sometimes be a pretty good strategy to place on the actual canes, but sometimes it's just going to be a lot of application. For deer strategies, you might consider on the ends of each of your trellis to hang up Irish spring soap. This is something that we do see a lot when it comes to apple trees and other fruit trees, as a repellent. And I think because of the trellising of your berries, you might also be able to do Irish Spring here, hanging it up on the ends. You might also look at micro enclosures. I'll send you a link to those. Those are very small fences that the deer tend to not like, just based on its proximity and just based on the way it's set up. You might also look at hot pepper spray. That's something that you could purchase. There are other sprays out there. You see this spray in this photo that I looked at one of our home and garden centers. The only thing to realize with this is sometimes they're not listed for fruit and vegetable. And so I would be very cautious of using some of these there. But you see what the active ingredient looks like, where it's whole egg solids and garlic to repel some of those deer. So for birds, one of the things to consider, especially with a new patch, is site selection away from trees. That is one thing to consider. I would also suggest that if you're feeding birds, if you have any bird feeders, try to put your berries far away from the feeding. Or if you feel like it, don't feed the birds, as the bird feeders tend to attract both birds as well as attracting smaller mammals. Netting could be an option. I think it's possible to use some sort of netting. And you see here, while this is blueberry that is shown, I think you could also kind of rig up a system with PVC pipe. And you kind of see it's bending over. And then from there, you might be able to put some netting in place. There are certainly scare devices. They tend to get pretty familiar with them. There's also combinations of different things, as well as kind of a toleration of certain actions. You see on this slide that I've crossed out chemical repellents of a grape Kool-Aid deterrent. That was suggested that was suggested a couple months ago in some of the literature, and yet there's been some further research come out that really doesn't impact this group. So I have further modified that recommendation for applying of a grape Kool-Aid deterrent. There was research, and yet the research isn't as thorough as we thought it was. So you've survived. You've planted them. They're harvesting. You're ready to enjoy your berries. When it comes to both of these raspberries, blackberries, they're going to produce in different ways. Yet again, it's back to, is it the Primocane producing or is it a Floricane producing? For your reds, your yellows, they will have these terminal buds that bloom first. So kind of the top of the cane is going to produce first, and then further down, it's going to produce with it. For your black, your purple berries, the fruit's going to ripen over a pretty short period of time, sometimes 2 to 2.5 weeks of production. It is really what we see here with this group of black and purple raspberries. For blackberries, you're looking for uniformly firm black. They will turn black before being ready, though. Just keep that in mind. Many of our kind of blackberries that are wild tend to have more of a glossy finish to them than our actual cultivated ones. Many of the cultivated varieties that you would purchase and plant have a bit more of a dull color to them. And especially if it's a thornless one, it will also have a dull color to it too. The raspberries are also split from their core. Just be very mindful of handling the berries because they are very fragile. So we're getting wrapped up tonight, which works out great because I wanted to spend some time to make sure we got some of your questions answered. I have a number of resources listed here. You are going to get an email that will link to every single one of these. I did want to highlight one of them in particular, this planting and trellising a home raspberry patch. It just came out a couple weeks ago from Annie Claude of University of Minnesota. And it's a really nice video overview on YouTube, but there also is a nice document that goes into the different ways that she's set up her home raspberry patch. And I really kind of like that overview. You know, there's a lot of resources from Ohio, Michigan are listed here too, as well as Arkansas. We do have a University of Illinois extension website, Berries and More, but it is very old and outdated information, and I'm hesitant to share it with you because of the outdatedness of it. So yet again, we've got more webinars coming up. Next week is raised beds and container vegetable gardening. You can still register for these events. The following week is going to be on May 13th is weed management in the vegetable garden. Then that will conclude our Get Growing series. So if you joined us last week for perennial vegetable and tonight you're halfway through, if you will. And another one of our horticulture educators is beginning his Growing Horticulture in Northwest Illinois series. So he'll start, I think he had one this week already. So next week is going to be growing and preserving herbs, followed by strawberries and potted terrariums. And I'll make sure that you have a link to register for those if you're interested, as it's being hosted by another University of Illinois Extension unit. So as we get wrapped up tonight, I think the one thing you need to consider is determining whether you want a Floricane or a Primocane type based on your needs and commitment. And as a refresher, as you've heard me use these words over and over again tonight, your Floricane type is going to be ones that produce your berries on 2-year-old canes. The Floricanes are also known as summer bearing. They are also known as June bearing. And your Primocane, those are going to produce on canes that produce this season. So you plant Primocane this season, it produces green canes, which produce a fall berry harvest. And then from there, you can either prune them all the way down or overwinter them and make them into Floricanes that next year. So think about your commitment and think about really what you're after. And certainly, as you think about these berry types, consider whether it has thorns, it's thornless, whether it's erect or semi-erect or trailing. That's going to be very crucial when it comes to what you're thinking of. Consider choosing your space wisely. Certainly think about making sure it's as weed-free as possible and space things correctly and plan for trellising support. There's so many great DIY systems out there for creating a trellising system that you're going to find that some that work really well for you. I always consider really starting strong the first years. Certainly it may wane after a couple of years, but these plants can really thrive and really grow for you. And you should anticipate spotted-winged Drosophila. You should anticipate that you should have a bad bucket and a good bucket. You should maybe hang up some hummingbird feeders to see if that impacts it. But certainly this is an insect that is affecting all of the cane fruit. Sometimes it's affecting blueberries. We see it affecting strawberries. Don't see it affect fruit trees too often. So this is my contact information along with my email, and I'm going to turn my camera back on and get through some of the questions you've got. So feel free to answer questions. Okay, so there was a question. Is there a high pH berry that can be used from wine making? Mine currently have a pH of 5.5 and I need 6+. Jem, you might look at some of those black, the black and purple raspberries. Those might be really good ones to start off with. Just based on the quality and just they've been recommended for winemaking, those might be ones to consider. I'm also going to send you a couple of resources that really go through a lot of those varieties of berries. And so you may find in there that there are certain ones that are mentioning which ones, if they're a red raspberry, that would work really well for you. Because certainly, you may find you may not want to do black or purple. Julie asked, how new is the raspberry Primocane? So the Primocane is going to be what develops this season. And you may find that if you have a plant that, is just planted the last couple of years, it's all dependent on soil temperatures warming up. And so the Primocanes may not have emerged just yet. You may just have your Floricanes in place. And the Primocanes may be emerging in maybe a month or two. The soil temperature is still just getting there when it comes to warming up. So if you don't see any just yet, I would say probably in the next month, you're going to see it start to warm up. There was a question from Christy, is it a better time to apply fertilizer or compost? If it's an established raspberry patch, I would say that it would be okay to apply that just as the soil temperature is starting to warm up. So the fertilizer, the compost, both of those can maybe be applied probably now, just as our soil is starting to warm up. If it was a new plant, I would probably I would certainly add compost a couple weeks before planting, and then I would plant, and then I would follow up a couple weeks after and actually apply the fertilizer. So give it some time for the compost to work and get things going, plant, and then a couple weeks later actually apply some of that 10-10-10 fertilizer. There was a statement from John and Cindy. Our raspberries are between our and our neighbor's garage. We just use tomato stakes and stakes with twine so we can go between them from harvesting. I agree. I think that's a great strategy, John and Cindy. You know, those really strong, sturdy T-posts I use for tomatoes, and I find that those could work really well for your raspberries too with it. You know, you just gotta have kind of some tensile, sometimes 12 gauge tensile to kind of run through, can work really well. Sandra states, I'm concerned about listeria appearing on the berries. Are the berries always safe to eat? So Sandra, I'm wondering what you're asking here. Are you asking about from grocery stores? You know, I know that there was that listeria outbreak a couple, I think it was last summer. Maybe that's what you're talking about here. You know, that's something I just don't know too much about. You know, if you are growing it at your home, you know, there shouldn't be any concern about listeria. You know, it could be kind of, if you're purchasing it from, say, a grocery store, I believe, you know, in most cases that this has been addressed already. They've addressed that food safety issue. There's a question, do picnic bugs bring disease or just damage the berries? Mine get picnic bugs every year. So yes, I mean, they are not bringing disease. They're not like vectoring it into their mouth, but it is possible that as they're eating, as they're chewing, they could potentially open up those sites for additional disease. And yet again, they're probably not targeting the canes, but they could be targeting some of those nodes, which would be where the leaves are meeting the canes. And that could be where disease could potentially be moving in. So that would be the one, that might be how disease is coming in. It's because of some of the picnic bug damage. There's a question, has anyone tried to individually wrap canes to eliminate spotted wing Drosophila? They haven't, you know, that's been one area that they haven't looked too much into. Because the damage they're doing is mostly on the fruit as it's developing, I think that would be the main problem, is that they're not doing damage on the cane, they're doing it on the actual berries as they're ripening. There has been some thought to actually sometimes prune some additional leaves to allow for some better airflow, which can sometimes bring in some additional insect predators. That's been some thought. There's also been some research that has looked to try to get kind of a thicker berry, especially on blueberries. They've tried this, but it is one that they're still trying to figure out what to do with, and certainly one that we're dealing with from small scale to large scale at this point. The hummingbirds is new. That's something that just came out a couple months ago. Question from Jem, will Roundup get rid of an unwanted berry patch? It's possible it might, Jem. Just want to be mindful of how you're applying it. You know, it is possible that it's going to be able to kind of rid you of that berry patch that's your unwanted. I think it's going to take some time though. I don't think it's going to be a very like easy thing to kind of remediate. So you may be fine with just kind of coming through and kind of pruning out some of it pretty easily if you could, although we certainly know an unwanted berry patch is very difficult to manage. So that might be a strategy if you're planning to not, you know, harvest from the patch. There was a question from Tom. When will be the last date for planting berries in Northern Illinois? If you're looking at, say, a Floricane type of plant, I would probably look at mid-June. I think mid-June is probably going to be the date, just based on soil temperature and based on weather we're experiencing at that time. That's probably going to be it. I'm concerned that if you push it too far into end of June and into July 4th, it's too warm. So I would try to kind of think about mid-June might be it for that plant. Question from for John and Cindy: do blueberries have the same types of problems? They do get impacted by spotted-winged Drosophila. So certainly they have that. They have similar, sometimes insect issues as well, and insect pressure. They have different diseases. They have just different pruning things, of course. But spotted-winged Drosophila is one that you will see on your blueberries as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Sandra added listeria showed up on watermelons and strawberries in some food stores the past few years. Yes, yeah, we had some listeria outbreaks. There was a couple of companies, or rather farms, that were they were harvesting the fruit, and they were not properly sterilizing the wash that they were giving to listeria, rather for watermelon and strawberries and some of the others. So it is one that, they've identified where the outbreak was from. And certainly there's a number of place guards that we have in place from a food safety point of view to ensure that these things are reduced. Many growers have to go through food safety certifications to be able to sell to farmers markets, to grocery stores. And it's these certifications that keep food outbreaks from occurring, but certainly they still occur. So it is one that you just want to be aware of. And certainly it's kind of up to you where you purchase the food from and so forth. But certainly there are safeguards in place, but of course, sometimes farms and others are not always following as they should. Question from Tom: when's the last date for planting Primocanes in Northern Illinois? Yeah, so this is one where I'm kind of, if you get an actual plant, so say you get the plant at the Home and Garden Center, you saw some of my photos, it already has some Primocanes developing off of it. And so once you put that plant into the soil, it should develop more Primocanes, at least that's our hope. And then ideally, you would be able to then get your fruit this fall. So I would still probably say mid-June. You might be able to push it a little bit more because you've got some development already. The limitation is the soil temperature, and it's the really warm weather. And as we've seen the last couple of years, sometimes Junes are really, really wet, or sometimes they're extremely hot. So it's hard to know what the best guess was. I would still say mid-June for both Primocanes and Floricanes, now that I think about it, especially if you had an actual plant. Like if you had a bare root where there was just no cane development whatsoever, I think you might be able to move that potentially the end of June into July, perhaps. But if it was an actual plant itself, I'd try to get into the ground probably by mid-June, whether it's Primocane or Floricane. So I gave you one answer, and now I'm kind of pulling back and saying, let's still aim for maybe mid-June for this with it. If it was bare root, you might be able to even do a fall planting because you don't have any of those canes that have yet developed. So any additional questions? I went over just a little bit, but I still want to make sure we're getting all these questions for you tonight. All right, so I don't see any more. You'll get an email tomorrow morning with all the resources I mentioned tonight, as well as links to some of those additional resources to share with you in the recordings. You'll get, hopefully by next week, you're going to get this actual recording. But between then and now, if you've got questions, you have anything like that, more than happy to kind of answer for you. We also did a webinar series this past January that covers all the other fruits. So we're covering strawberries, tree fruits, and so forth. So I'll send that along so you have that as well. Thanks for joining me tonight. Have a great night and enjoy the rest of your evening.